The email came at 9:12 a.m. on a Tuesday. Effective immediately, your position has been eliminated due to operational efficiency measures. No meeting, no warning, just a few cold lines from HR after 16 years of loyalty. I sat at my desk staring at the screen, barely hearing the chatter of the office around me. Efficiency. That was the word they used, like I was a faulty cog in their shiny new machine. What made it sting worse was that the decision came from Daniel, the same CEO who once told me, "You're the backbone of this department." Now, apparently, I was dead weight. I packed up my things quietly while people avoided eye contact. No one wanted to be seen comforting the guy who'd just been fired. I understood. Corporate loyalty was a myth, and I had just been its latest sacrifice. Still, I couldn't shake the irony. I was the one who'd written the compliance framework that kept this company legal. I knew every loophole, every weak point, every single clause that shielded them from government scrutiny. And they'd fired me for efficiency. Leaving that building felt like walking out of a burning house I'd spent years building. But as I stood in the parking lot, watching the company logo glimmer in the morning sun, something inside me shifted. I wasn't angry yet, just numb. But that numbness hardened over the next few weeks into something colder, sharper. They hadn't just fired me, they'd dismantled the safety net I'd created. And without me, that net was going to tear wide open. It started when I got a call from an old colleague, someone who'd been too nervous to speak to me at the office. "They're changing your compliance model," she whispered. "Cutting costs. Outsourcing key audits." I couldn't believe it. The very system that kept them from breaching regulatory limits was being streamlined to save a few $1,000,000. I laughed bitterly. They didn't realize they'd just opened a gap wide enough to swallow the entire company. I didn't sabotage anything. I didn't have to. The system worked fine when maintained properly. Without the right oversight, though, it became a ticking time bomb. Over the next 6 months, I watched from a distance as they bragged about their record profits, their modernized workflows, their new AI-driven compliance dashboards. On the surface, everything looked perfect. But beneath that, small cracks were forming, missed filings, overlooked reports, and unmonitored data transfers. I knew exactly where they'd appear because I'd designed the structure myself. One afternoon, I received a notice in the mail, a subpoena. Apparently, regulators were investigating a potential compliance irregularity involving data privacy violations at my old company. My name came up as the architect of the original system. I met with the officials, laid out my documentation, and explained everything: how the company had gutted the system, ignored its safeguards, and overridden its alerts. I didn't embellish, I didn't accuse, I just told the truth, supported by evidence. And that truth was damning. 3 months later, it hit the news. The company had been fined $750 million for non-compliance with international data protection laws. Their share price plummeted overnight. Daniel was forced to resign. Investors fled. The empire I'd helped build crumbled under the weight of its own arrogance. I didn't celebrate, but I didn't feel sorry either. They'd fired the one person who understood the very rules keeping them alive. Efficiency had cost them everything. Then came the irony. One of the agencies that had audited the case offered me a consulting contract to help other companies avoid the same disaster. Within a year, I had my own firm, specializing in compliance recovery. Companies that once dismissed me now paid 6 figures for my advice. My reputation soared, and my firm grew rapidly. I wasn't just back on my feet, I was thriving, while they were still tangled in lawsuits and headlines. A few years later, I received an invitation, ironically, from the same company, now under new leadership, asking if I'd consider returning as a strategic advisor. I stared at the email for a long time, half amused, half astonished. I replied with one line, efficiency achieved. That night, I sat on my balcony overlooking the city, sipping coffee as the lights flickered across the skyline. I thought about how easily they'd discarded me, how confidently they'd assumed I was replaceable. They never realized that true efficiency isn't about cutting people, it's about understanding value. They fired me to save a fraction of a percent on costs. That decision cost them $750 million. Sometimes revenge doesn't need to be planned. It just happens naturally, when arrogance meets its own reflection. Months passed after the fallout, and the shockwaves from the $750 million fine were still rippling through the business world. My former company, once a shining symbol of corporate dominance, had become the perfect example of what happens when greed overtakes wisdom. News outlets dissected their downfall for weeks, analysts debated where they went wrong, and every article seemed to echo the same phrase, a preventable disaster caused by internal negligence. I knew that negligence was corporate language for firing the wrong man. I didn't speak publicly at first. I didn't need to. My name had already been cleared in every report. Regulators praised the original compliance model, calling it robust, sophisticated, and foolproof when managed correctly. My fingerprints were all over their success and their downfall, but only one part had been my doing, the foundation. They'd been the ones who ripped it apart. Then one morning, I received a call from a journalist from the Financial Herald. She wanted to interview me for a feature called The Man Who Warned Them. I agreed. The interview was calm, factual, and professional. I never mentioned revenge or anger. I just spoke about the importance of integrity, of how efficiency shouldn't come at the cost of accountability. When the article went live, it spread like wildfire. The comment sections were full of people calling me a hero, a cautionary tale, or simply, the guy who knew what he was doing. That exposure catapulted my firm, Regulus Compliance, into the spotlight. Within months, I was consulting for 3 Fortune 500 companies and a government agency. My phone never stopped ringing. Ironically, half of my new clients were coming from the same industry as my former employer. I was fixing the very type of systems they'd broken. Every contract felt like poetic justice written in legal ink. But success didn't dull the memory. Sometimes, I still thought about Daniel, the CEO who'd called me redundant. He'd vanished after the scandal, but one evening, as I was leaving a corporate gala, I saw him across the room. He looked older, tired, a shadow of the man who once strutted through glass corridors. Our eyes met for a brief second. He hesitated, then started walking toward me. "David," he said softly, his voice stripped of arrogance. I wanted to say, I was wrong. I should have listened. I looked at him, seeing not the enemy I once hated, but a man completely hollowed by his own pride. "It wasn't about listening to me," I said. "It was about listening to reason. You chose shortcuts instead." He nodded, his shoulders sagging. "They told me it would save millions." "It cost you everything," I replied. He didn't argue. He just sighed and walked away. And as he did, I realized something. I no longer needed revenge. I already had peace. Years later, Regulus became a global name in corporate compliance, with offices in London, Tokyo, and New York. We built systems so airtight that regulators started adopting our standards as benchmarks. I wasn't just fixing companies anymore, I was shaping how the world understood responsibility. Every time a firm hired us, they weren't just paying for compliance, they were paying for conscience. On the anniversary of my firing, I found myself back in the same parking lot where I had once stood with a cardboard box in my hands. The building looked different now, rebranded, repainted, but still recognizable. I walked up to the glass doors, looked inside, and for a fleeting second, saw a younger version of myself sitting at that desk, hopeful, loyal, naive. I smiled at the memory, then turned away. Somewhere deep down, I realized the truth. They hadn't fired me for efficiency, they'd fired me because efficiency scared them. Real efficiency isn't about cutting costs or replacing people. It's about competence, discipline, and knowing where not to take shortcuts. They mistook my precision for rigidity, my loyalty for weakness. And in the end, their mistake became my masterpiece. Because when they fired me for efficiency, I didn't lose my job. I gained my legacy. They thought they could delete my name from the system I built. But all they did was make sure it became part of history. After that night in the parking lot, I drove home in silence, the city lights flickering past my windshield like echoes of the past. I had moved on, built something extraordinary, but standing there, where it all started, brought a sense of completion I didn't expect. The bitterness that once fueled me was gone. In its place was something stronger, clarity. I understood now that revenge wasn't destruction, it was transformation. What I'd done wasn't sabotage. It was accountability, executed in the only language the powerful understand: results. A few months later, I received an invitation that almost made me laugh out loud. The Global Finance Association had chosen me as the keynote speaker for their annual conference in Geneva. The theme? Sustainable efficiency in the modern enterprise. I couldn't have scripted it better. When I stepped onto that stage, thousands of executives filled the room, some from companies that had once dismissed my work. A few even from my old firm. I spotted familiar faces, former colleagues, even a few board members who'd voted to let me go. Their eyes widened as they saw me take the microphone. I opened with a smile and said, "Efficiency isn't about doing more with less. It's about doing what's right, especially when no one's watching." The room fell silent. Every word I spoke after that wasn't just a lecture, it was a mirror. I wasn't naming names, but everyone knew who I was talking about. They'd all read the headlines. And when I ended with, "A system is only as ethical as the people who run it," the applause was thunderous. Cameras flashed. Journalists scribbled furiously. For me, that applause wasn't for the speech, it was for vindication. Afterward, a small group of executives approached me privately. Among them was the new CEO of my old company. He extended his hand and said, "David, we'd like to work with you. We're trying to rebuild." For a brief second, I thought about refusing. But then I remembered what my mentor once told me: real strength isn't holding a grudge, it's holding the standard. So I shook his hand and said, "You can hire my firm. But I don't work for you anymore, I work above you." That contract became the most profitable deal of my career. I didn't see it as a victory over them, it was a victory for me, for the people who still believed that integrity mattered. Under my guidance, their company slowly recovered, this time built on the very framework they once threw away. The irony was beautiful: my compliance system, rebuilt by the man they'd fired. Years rolled by, and my name became synonymous with resilience. Universities invited me to guest lecture, entrepreneurs sought mentorship. I even published a book titled The Efficiency Paradox, which topped business bestseller lists for nearly a year. But what meant more than fame or money was seeing people actually change: CEOs choosing transparency, employees being empowered to question bad decisions, companies rebuilding trust from the inside out. My revenge had turned into reform. One afternoon, while mentoring a group of young analysts, one of them asked, "Mr. Harlan, what's the secret to surviving corporate betrayal?" I smiled. "Simple," I said. "Don't fight to stay where you're not valued. Build something they can't replace. The best revenge isn't payback, it's permanence." That night, as I walked out of my firm's glass tower, the skyline reflected on the windows, glittering like it had the night I was fired. The same city that once chewed me up now carried my name on its contracts, its systems, its future. I paused for a moment, watching the traffic move like a pulse of ambition. I realized then that revenge wasn't about watching others fall, it was about rising so high that their memory no longer touches you. And as I stood there, I whispered the words that had carried me through it all: they fired me for efficiency. But what they didn't understand is that I was the efficiency. Then I walked away, calm, certain, and untouchable. Months later, I received a letter that took me completely by surprise. It was handwritten, an old-fashioned touch, from none other than Daniel, my former CEO, the man who'd once told me I was too rigid for innovation. I hesitated before opening it, wondering what could possibly be left to say after all this time. Inside, the writing was uneven, almost shaky. He'd left the industry, apparently, and was living quietly somewhere along the coast. His words were simple, almost haunting. "David, I thought I understood success. But watching everything crumble taught me something I should have learned from you years ago. Principles are not obstacles to progress. They're the only thing that keeps progress from devouring itself. You were right, and I was blind. I hope, wherever you are, you're still building something that lasts." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my desk drawer beside an old employee badge I'd kept all these years. For a moment, I felt something unexpected, not pride, not pity, but closure. That man had destroyed my career once, but in his downfall, he had found his humanity again. It reminded me that revenge wasn't always about humiliation. Sometimes, it was about revelation. The next morning, I walked into Regulus headquarters, where the lobby walls now displayed the slogan my team had chosen: integrity scales. Beneath it, the signatures of every employee who had joined since we'd founded the company. We had grown into a family, a group bound not by hierarchy, but by shared values. My assistant greeted me with a grin and handed over the latest financial report. "We landed the United Bank contract," she said. "They said your keynote inspired them to rethink their compliance model." I smiled, thinking about the irony. The same kind of financial institution that once ignored warnings like mine was now paying millions to implement them. It felt poetic, an entire system finally waking up to the lessons I had been fired for teaching. Later that evening, I visited the rooftop balcony. The city sprawled beneath me. The hum of traffic below felt like a living reminder of everything I'd built from ruin. The skyline had changed since that day I carried a cardboard box out of the office, but so had I. I wasn't the same man who once begged to be seen. I had become someone who no longer needed validation from those above him. Because I had built the ceiling they once tried to trap me under. I poured myself a glass of scotch and gazed at the horizon, where the last rays of sunset brushed against the steel towers. My reflection stared back from the window, older, steadier, unbroken. "They fired me for efficiency," I murmured, almost laughing now. And I gave the world a new definition of it. As the night deepened, I realized that somewhere between revenge and redemption, I had found something far rarer: peace. The kind that comes not from proving others wrong, but from proving yourself right, quietly, relentlessly, and on your own terms. The next day, we opened a new branch in Singapore. A banner hung across the front glass doors with a simple phrase I had written myself: "Efficiency is temporary. Integrity is forever." And that, I knew, would be my true legacy. Not the revenge. Not the billion-dollar collapse. But the quiet truth that outlasted them all. The Singapore launch was flawless. Dignitaries, executives, and young professionals from around the world filled the marble atrium. I stood near the entrance, shaking hands, smiling politely, but inside, I felt something deeper, a sense of coming full circle. Years ago, I'd stood in a similar building, holding a termination letter, convinced my world was ending. Now I stood in one built from my own vision, my own rules, and my own scars. Every conversation that night carried a certain quiet satisfaction. I didn't need to tell my story anymore. It was etched into every contract, every system, every reputation saved because we existed. Later that evening, during the gala dinner, the host called me on stage to deliver a closing note. I hadn't planned to speak, but as I looked at the audience, hundreds of faces filled with ambition, I felt compelled to. There was a time, I began, when I believed revenge was the end goal. When I thought the sweetest victory was proving someone wrong. But I've learned that the real victory is living right, building something that lasts long after the noise fades. The room fell silent. The only sound was the faint hum of cameras recording. They called me inefficient once, I continued, because I cared too much about doing things properly. Because I refused to cut corners. Because I believed every system deserved respect, not shortcuts. They fired me for that. But tonight, I stand here because of it. The applause that followed wasn't explosive, it was steady, heartfelt, honest. The kind of applause that doesn't come from excitement but from understanding. People weren't clapping for a comeback story. They were clapping for the idea that integrity still had a place in the modern world. After the event, a young analyst approached me, maybe in his mid-20s, the same age I was when I first started out. "Mr. Harlan," he said nervously, "I watched my company cut corners the same way yours did years ago. I thought about quitting, but your story, it made me want to fix things instead. Thank you." That hit me harder than any headline, any award, any contract. Because in that moment, I realized my revenge had become something far more powerful, influence. My story wasn't just mine anymore. It was a spark in other people's courage. A week later, back in my office overlooking the city skyline, I found myself alone again, the quiet hum of the servers and the faint ticking of the clock filling the room. I leaned back in my chair and smiled faintly. The company that once fired me no longer existed. Their brand had been sold, merged, and dissolved. Meanwhile, Regulus was thriving, expanding across continents. On my desk sat two things: the original termination letter, framed under glass, and the latest edition of Forbes, where an article titled "The Man Who Made Compliance Cool" featured my photo on the cover. I didn't care for fame, but the irony wasn't lost on me. I picked up my coffee, looked out at the horizon, and whispered to no one in particular, "You can fire a man, but you can't fire his principles." And in that moment, with the city lights stretching far into the distance, I knew I had won, not because I'd destroyed anyone, but because I'd built something unshakable. My revenge had started as a spark of defiance. But it ended as a legacy, one that would outlast every short-sighted decision, every greedy executive, and every false promise of efficiency. And somewhere, deep inside, the younger version of me, the one standing with a box of his belongings outside a cold office building, finally smiled back. Years later, the story of my firing became almost mythical in the industry. Business schools used it as a case study, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. Professors would walk into their lecture halls, pull up slides of my former company's collapse, and ask, "What happens when you mistake loyalty for liability?" My name wasn't just a footnote anymore, it had become a lesson. One afternoon, I was invited to give a guest lecture at Stanford. The auditorium was packed, not just with students, but executives, investors, and consultants who'd flown in from different parts of the world. The irony wasn't lost on me. I once sat in offices begging people to care about ethics. Now, people were paying to hear me speak about it. I stepped to the podium and said, they called me old-fashioned. Said I was slowing progress. But progress without conscience isn't advancement, it's collapse in disguise. I paused, scanning the faces in front of me. And the funny thing about shortcuts, I added, is that they always seem faster, until you hit the wall. A few students chuckled, but most just nodded, they got it. They understood what it meant to be undervalued, underestimated, and dismissed in the name of efficiency. When the talk ended, people lined up to shake my hand, to thank me, to share their stories of being told they cared too much. And every time I heard that phrase, I smiled. Caring too much had once cost me everything, now it was the reason I had everything. That night, as I left the campus and walked past the stone archways, I thought about my mentor, the man who had once told me, if they ever punish you for doing what's right, wear it as a badge. I had done exactly that. The scars of my firing had become medals, invisible, but undeniable. Back at Regulus, we had grown into something much larger than I ever dreamed. Thousands of employees across multiple countries, clients from every corner of the world, and a philosophy that had become our compass, integrity before profit. Some thought it was idealistic, but our success proved otherwise. We weren't just another consulting firm, we were the firewall between chaos and accountability. One evening, as I sat in the boardroom reviewing expansion plans for Europe, my daughter, now in her 20s, came in holding an envelope. "Dad," she said with a grin, "you got this from the U.S. Patent Office." I opened it, expecting paperwork, but inside was something unexpected, a letter acknowledging that several compliance mechanisms I'd designed years ago were now considered industry standards. They weren't just patents anymore, they were policy. I leaned back, speechless for a moment. The systems I'd built to protect companies from collapse, the same ones they'd once mocked, were now the backbone of how corporations operated. It hit me then, this wasn't just revenge. It was immortality. I walked to the window, the city lights shimmering against the night sky, and thought about all the sleepless nights, the humiliation, the bitterness, and how every bit of it had been worth it. Because from the ashes of being labeled inefficient, I had built something no one could dismantle. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. My assistant stepped in. "Sir, the conference line is ready." "It's with the European Commission." I smiled faintly. "Put them through." As the call connected and the familiar hum of international voices filled the room, I adjusted my tie, my reflection caught in a glass wall, older, wiser, sharper. The man they fired no longer existed. The man who replaced him was unstoppable. And as I prepared to speak, I couldn't help but think back to that single word, efficiency. They'd used it to end me. Now, I defined it. The voices on the conference line quieted as I unmuted my microphone. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my tone calm but commanding. Across that digital table sat some of the most powerful regulators and executives in Europe, people who once would have dismissed someone like me as an obstacle. Now, they waited on my expertise. I outlined a new compliance framework that balanced speed with accountability, growth with ethics. It wasn't just policy, it was philosophy in motion. By the time I finished, the room on the other end erupted in applause. One of the commissioners said, "Mr. Harlan, your model could become the global standard." I smiled faintly and replied, "That's the goal, not to be followed, but to set the example." After the meeting, I stayed behind in the empty boardroom, the quiet hum of the city below filling the silence. I looked around at the sleek glass walls, the digital screens displaying performance graphs, and thought about how different this space was from the cubicle I once called my kingdom. There was a time when I thought climbing the corporate ladder meant success. Now I understood that real success was building the ladder itself, and making sure it didn't break under those who followed. The next morning, I flew to Zurich for a summit. During the flight, I looked out the window as the clouds drifted below, thinking about how strange life could be. The man who'd once been escorted out of an office by security now traveled first class to advise governments. The same inefficient methods that got me fired were now considered revolutionary. Life had a wicked sense of irony, but I'd learned to appreciate its rhythm. At the summit, I was seated next to the chairwoman of a major global bank. She leaned over during lunch and said, "You know, we used to think efficiency was about speed. Now, after your model, we've realized it's about sustainability." I chuckled softly. Speed gets you ahead, I said. Sustainability keeps you there. She nodded thoughtfully, and for a brief second, I saw in her eyes the same realization I had all those years ago, that doing things right isn't slow, it's smart. After the event, I stepped outside into the cold Swiss air, the Alps faintly visible in the distance. My phone buzzed with messages, investors, clients, interviews, but I ignored them all for a moment, just taking in the silence. Revenge had brought me power, but purpose had brought me peace. I finally understood that I hadn't spent my years fighting a company. I'd been fighting a culture, one that worshipped profit over people, speed over sense. And I'd won. Not with destruction, but with design. A few weeks later, I returned home. My daughter greeted me at the door, laughing as she showed me a framed magazine cover, Time's Global Leaders of Integrity, and there I was, my photo beneath the headline, The Man Who Changed the Meaning of Efficiency. I couldn't help but laugh. It took them long enough, I said. That evening, we sat by the fireplace, just the two of us. She looked at me and said, Dad, do you ever miss it? The company, the old days? I thought for a long moment. No, I finally said. I don't miss the place that fired me. I miss the man who thought he needed their approval. She smiled quietly, understanding more than I said aloud. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow over the room. It wasn't the grand revenge I once dreamed of, no public humiliation, no dramatic downfall. Instead, it was quiet triumph. Steady. Lasting. Before bed, I walked into my study one last time. The framed termination letter still hung on the wall, not as a wound, but as a reminder. Below it, I'd added a small brass plaque with an engraving that simply read, They fired me for efficiency. I built the standard. And that was the truth of it. Not a story of vengeance, but of evolution. They had written me off as obsolete, but I'd become the blueprint. And as I turned off the light and looked once more at the skyline, bright, alive, unshaken, I realized something that made me smile. They might have fired me from a job. But I had turned that dismissal into something eternal. They taught me that loyalty was fragile. I taught them that legacy isn't. Years later, when people mentioned my name in boardrooms or business schools, it was never with pity, it was with respect. My firing had become a symbol, a story passed down to new generations of workers and leaders alike. They called it the efficiency lesson. I'd gone from being the man quietly pushed out of an office to the man whose philosophy redefined how corporations operated. The irony was perfect. They had fired me to silence my influence, and in doing so, they amplified it beyond their imagination. I often found myself invited to conferences, universities, and corporate retreats, where people would stand and applaud before I even spoke. Yet, I never let it get to my head. I'd learned long ago that applause fades. What matters is the echo you leave behind. When people came up to me afterward and said, "Your story saved my career," or "I stopped compromising my values because of you," I knew that the real revenge was already complete. It wasn't about retribution. It was about restoration, restoring faith, discipline, and integrity to a world that had almost forgotten them. On the anniversary of my firing, 20 years to the day, I visited the site of my old company's headquarters. The building was gone now, replaced by a tech incubator filled with young entrepreneurs. Where cold glass walls once loomed, sunlight now poured through open windows. I smiled as I walked through the lobby, invisible among the crowd of dreamers. They didn't know who I was, and they didn't need to. The world had moved on, but in many ways, it had moved in the direction I once fought for. As I stepped outside, I pulled from my coat pocket the brass plaque I'd once hung under my termination letter. I ran my fingers over the engraving. They fired me for efficiency. I built the standard. Then, with a small laugh, I left it on the marble bench near the entrance. A quiet signature to a story that no longer needed an ending. The sun was setting when I reached the parking lot, painting the city gold. For a moment, I stood there and thought of the man I used to be, desperate to prove himself, afraid of losing everything. I wished I could tell him that losing everything was the best thing that ever happened. That sometimes, what feels like the end is just the beginning written in a different language. I got into my car, started the engine, and looked at the skyline one last time. It shimmered with progress, ambition, and possibility, the very things that had once betrayed me but had now become my greatest allies. And as I drove away, the words that had defined my journey whispered through my mind one final time. They fired me for efficiency. But they'll remember me for eternity.